Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that a trade policy designed to protect a nation's industry could end up crippling its consumers, empowering its biggest geopolitical rival, and destabilizing the security of an entire continent? And how can a relationship that supplies more energy to the United States than Saudi Arabia and Venezuela combined serves as the largest export market for American goods and acts as the primary physical shield for the homeland suddenly be dismissed as optional? It is not every day that a single sentence shakes 5,500 miles of border, 150 years of alliance, and the quiet assumptions of an entire continent. But when a former U.S. president suggests that Canada, America's longest-standing partner, its largest trading corridor, and its closest cultural mirror might be optional, something fundamental breaks open. Because if a superpower can suddenly question the value of its calmest neighbor, we have to ask, what does Washington think is no longer necessary? And what beneath the surface has been simmering for decades without the public noticing? To understand the panic in Washington after such a remark and the confusion that ripples through the Pentagon, the State Department, and the boardrooms of Wall Street, we have to confront a paradox. On paper, the USC-Canada relationship looks unshakable. Canada supplies the United States with critical energy, rare earth minerals, and defense cooperation that is unprecedented in world history. It is the United States' top export market, bigger than China, Japan, and the UK put together, and it provides something even more valuable: geopolitical insulation. 2 oceans, 1 Arctic, and 1 friendly northern shield, the kind of geography most nations can only dream of. And yet, despite this strategic jackpot, Washington has begun hinting that the North American arrangement is less of a sacred pact and more of a flexible convenience, optional even. But that raises a disturbing question that will guide our analysis today. How does something so structurally essential become rhetorically disposable? How does a partnership that kept the continent stable through 2 world wars, the Cold War, and the age of globalized supply chains suddenly get framed as excess baggage? The answer lies in the deeper tectonics of American politics: tensions about manufacturing, migration, defense spending, and the new economics of great power competition. If you follow those threads back far enough, you eventually reach the same uncomfortable truth. The United States no longer sees its allies the way it did 30 years ago, and Canada, despite being the closest of them, is caught in a new strategic recalibration that it did not choose but cannot escape. I am very curious to hear your perspective on this shift. Do you believe that traditional alliances are still essential in the modern era, or is a more transactional approach the way forward for the United States? Please share your thoughts in the comments below as we continue to explore the consequences of this mindset. To make sense of this shift, we must look beyond the political theater and examine the machinery of the continent itself. We need to dissect the optional narrative not as an insult, but as a stress test on the complex integrated organism that is the North American economy. When we do, we find that the rhetoric of independence often crashes violently against the physics of interdependence. To understand this, we must first dismantle the myth of separation and examine the North American organism as it truly exists. Most people imagine countries as independent units standing side by side on a map separated by clear lines and distinct colors. But North America doesn't function that way. It behaves more like a single sprawling economic organism with uneven weight distribution. The United States is the energy grid vulnerabilities and integration gravitational center, certainly, but Canada and Mexico are not satellites orbiting at a distance. They are structural limbs. Remove one, even hypothetically, and the entire continental body has to reorganize how it walks, breathes, and produces. This integration is so quiet, so efficient that it becomes invisible, and because it is invisible, it breeds complacency. We have to go back to the late 1980s when the idea of a seamless continental economy was first sold as the future. NAFTA wasn't simply a trade deal, it was the blueprint for a new North American system. The promise was simple: integrate production lines, expand cross-border energy networks, align industrial standards, and create a vast economic basin capable of rivaling Europe and East Asia. For decades, that logic held. Automobiles, aircraft parts, agricultural goods, electricity, everything was built on the assumption that the border was not a barrier, but a seam. What left Detroit in the morning might be assembled in Ontario by the afternoon. The system worked so smoothly that by the early 2000s, policymakers stopped questioning it altogether. Stability became invisible. But stability has a price: complacency. And that complacency masked a growing imbalance in how each side viewed the relationship. Canadians saw integration as partnership. Washington saw it increasingly as leverage. You can hear the shift in political language over the years. Mutual benefits slowly gave way to America first. Shared prosperity became U.S. manufacturing losses. And when economic anxiety exploded after the 2008 financial crisis, the idea that the United States owed anything to any partner, even its closest one, lost its political appeal. However, rhetoric cannot rewrite infrastructure. The reality of this organism is nowhere more apparent and nowhere more critical than in the energy grid. As the world moves toward electrifying economies, countries like the USA and China are modernizing their grids. Estimates suggest that advanced economies like Canada will take 2 to 3 times as much electricity by 2050, and developing economies 3 to 5 times as much. This raises the critical issue of grid modernization and integration, terms that may sound geeky but are fundamental to the economic survival of the continent. We are seeing the formation of groups like Canada Grid advocating for the integration of the grid, not just east and west within Canada, but north and south with the American grid. The logic is grounded in the physics of renewable energy. As renewables like solar and wind penetrate more into electricity systems, dealing with intermittency becomes the primary challenge. When the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing, you need a backup. The most efficient way to deal with this is to have bigger markets trading with neighbors who have different weather patterns and different resources. Currently, the U.S. federal government has a regulator, FK, with authority over electricity. In Canada, provinces hold that power, creating a fragmented system where BC trades with Washington, Manitoba with Minnesota, and Quebec with New York. But this fragmentation is a liability. A fully integrated grid allows for hydro batteries. On a sunny day in California, when there is a surplus of solar electrons that cannot be used or stored, that power could theoretically be sent north, allowing British Columbia to keep water behind its dams. Later, when the sun sets or the wind dies down in the U.S., that stored water can be released to generate power and send it back south. This is not just trade, it is resilience. It creates a system that can withstand the heat domes, the polar vortexes, and the extreme weather exacerbated by climate change. Yet this essential integration faces threats not just from political rhetoric, but from security vulnerabilities that arise when nations try to go it alone or cut corners. Though the lumber trade war backfire, U.S. power grid is currently at risk, arguably weaker than the public understands. A vast preponderance of large electricity transformers in the U.S. are Chinese manufactured. Security experts have raised alarms that these components could contain backdoors, allowing hostile actors to turn them off remotely. We do not inspect them rigorously. In a world where the U.S. is trying to decouple from Chinese influence, the idea of alienating Canada The only secure democratic partner capable of co-managing a continental energy security strategy is strategically incoherent. If you claim allies are optional, you create the expectation that America can operate alone. But if America tries to operate alone in a world defined by interlocking supply chains and contested energy routes, it risks overextending itself. Saying Canada is optional is like saying a keystone is optional because it looks simple. Remove it, and the arch collapses not through sabotage but through physics. This dynamic is perfectly illustrated by the lumber boomerang, a case study in protectionist failure. To understand what happens when political rhetoric tries to override this structural reality, we need only look at the recent history of the softwood lumber trade. This is a perfect case study of how a policy designed to protect a nation's industry can end up crippling its consumers and empowering its competitors. When the U.S. administration declared its intention to impose tremendous tariffs on Canadian lumber, the justification was framed in the language of national strength and self-sufficiency. We don't need Canada's lumber. We have more lumber than they do. This assertion dismissed decades of deeply integrated economic partnership and fundamentally misread the realities of the North American supply chain. The United States, despite its vast forests, does not produce enough softwood lumber to meet its own domestic demand, particularly for residential construction. The nation imports approximately 1/3 of all the lumber it consumes. And of that massive volume, nearly 85% originates from Canada. This is not a casual trade relationship. It is a foundational pillar of the American construction sector. Canada supplies around 12 billion board feet of softwood lumber annually, framing millions of American homes. The central assumption of the protectionist policy was that American mills could simply ramp up production to fill the void. This crumbled under scrutiny. Even if every single sawmill in the United States operated at absolute maximum capacity, 247s, the nation would still face a shortfall of more than 3.2 billion board feet. The domestic industry was already running near 95% capacity, constrained by a shortage of skilled labor and aging equipment. You cannot simply will a new supply chain into existence. Building new mills takes years and billions of dollars in a cyclical industry that investors are wary of. The consequences of ignoring this reality were immediate and violent. Commodity markets went wild. Lumber prices soared past $650, eventually climbing towards $765 per thousand board feet. This wasn't just a number on a screen. It was a tax on the American dream. The National Association of Home Builders quantified the damage. For every 1% increase in the price of lumber, the total cost of constructing an average single-family home rose by over $1,000. With prices spiking, this translated into a surcharge of more than $10,000 per home. Builders halted projects. Families were priced out of the market. The policy designed to protect American jobs ended up actively squeezing American families and fueling inflation. And did it save the U.S. lumber industry? No. Protected by tariff walls, U.S. mills had little incentive to innovate, remaining inefficient and labor-constrained. Meanwhile, the reaction in Canada fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape of the trade. Instead of engaging in a tit-for-tat trade war, Canada focused on resilience, critical minerals, and Arctic security and adaptation. The federal and provincial governments, alongside industry leaders, realized they could no longer rely on the U.S. as their sole customer. They initiated a strategic pivot to global markets. Driven by a need to diversify, Canadian producers began an aggressive push into Asia and Europe. Exports to Japan increased by 26%. New trade deals were struck with South Korea and Germany. But more importantly, the Canadian industry moved up the value chain. They reinvested the higher revenues, ironically fueled by U.S. tariffs, into new technologies, specifically mass timber and engineered wood products. They rebranded Canadian lumber as the green steel of the future. Aligning with global ESG, environmental, social, and governance goals, by 2025, Canadian firms had boosted shipments to non-U.S. markets by nearly 20%. The U.S. tariffs had inadvertently pushed Canada to build a more resilient, technologically advanced, and globally respected industry, while the American sector remained mired in the very challenges the policy was supposed to solve. Canada is now on track to become the largest lumber export hub outside of Northern Europe. The lesson is stark. When you treat a partner as optional, they eventually find other options and you are left paying the price. This brings us to the dairy dilemma, which vividly exposes the fragility of our food systems. The misunderstanding of supply chains that drove the lumber disaster is replicated perhaps even more vividly in the dairy sector. Here the rhetoric was equally bold. We don't need their milk. We have plenty of milk. And on the surface, this seems true. The U.S. produces vast quantities of fluid cow milk. But the devil in the dinner is in the details. The U.S. dairy ecosystem is highly optimized for cow milk, but lacks the capacity for specialty products, specifically goat cheese, sheep milk cheese, and artisan soft cheeses that have become staples of the American culinary landscape. These products are imported heavily from Quebec and Ontario. When political leaders threatened to cut off Canadian dairy, they weren't just threatening milk, they were threatening the diversity of the American food supply. Food systems do not pivot on a dime. You cannot treat a biological supply chain like a light switch. Goats and sheep are not machines. You cannot just turn a dial and increase production. Building a herd takes years. Developing the specific expertise to create high-quality brie or camembert takes generations of institutional knowledge. Most American dairy farms are set up for cows. Retrofitting them for small ruminants is expensive and time-consuming. The impact of the optional rhetoric was felt almost immediately in grocery stores and restaurants. Importers, fearing a sudden policy shift, began to panic. Supply chains already stretched by labor shortages buckled. Specialty cheeses went on back order. Prices rose. Restaurants had to change menus. It served as a clear warning. Even a small percentage of trade, if it consists of non-substitutable goods, is critical. The U.S. claimed independence based on volume, ignoring the nuance of variety and specialization. By pretending it could do everything alone, it created friction where there was flow. And just like with lumber, Canada is not sitting idle. Canadian producers have ready buyers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East for their high-quality products. If the U.S. market closes, those goods will flow elsewhere, and the American consumer will be left with higher prices and fewer choices. It is a microcosm of the larger issue. The U.S. is strong, but it is not fully self-sufficient in the way populist rhetoric suggests. Beyond economics, we must consider the strategic buffer provided by critical minerals and continental defense. If lumber and dairy are about economics and inflation, the conversation shifts to existential stakes when we talk about the erosion of strategic trust, critical minerals, and defense. This is where the narrative of Canada as optional becomes not just expensive but dangerous. We are currently living through a global resource war. The transition to green energy and the digitization of the economy depend on a specific set of inputs: lithium, cobalt, graphite, nickel, and rare earth elements. These are the oil of the 21st century. Currently, China dominates the processing of these minerals. They control the supply chains, refine the materials, often using coal-fired power and forced labor, such as in the Uyghur region, and set the global price. The United States is desperate to break this dependency. It needs a secure, reliable source of these materials to build electric vehicles, fighter jets, and batteries. And here is the reality. Canada is the only democratic nation with the resource reserves, the mining expertise, and the geographic proximity to solve this problem for the U.S. Canada sits on vast reserves of these critical minerals. It provides inputs the U.S. cannot source domestically at scale. But it's not just about digging rocks out of the ground, it's about where they go. China is actively courting the Canadian mining sector. European competitors are eyeing Canadian natural gas. If Washington pushes Canada away, treating it as a competitor rather than an ally, it risks losing preferential access to the very resources it needs to compete with China. We discussed earlier how Chinese transformers pose a security risk to the U.S. grid. The solution to that risk is a North American supply chain, but you cannot build a North American supply chain if you are actively dismantling the North American political alliance. Furthermore, we must look at the map. Defense planners often describe Canada not as an ally, but as part of the homeland's outer infrastructure. It is a security buffer, a production buffer, and an energy buffer. The U.S. and Canada jointly operate NORAD, the only bational military command in the world. They coordinate Arctic surveillance, air defense, and early warning systems. This role is becoming more critical, not less. The Arctic is melting, opening new shipping lanes, and exposing vast energy reserves. Russia controls half the Arctic coastline. China has declared itself a near-Arctic state. The only thing preventing aggressive encroachment on the North American side is the seamless cooperation between the U.S. and Canada. If political distrust begins to corrode that cooperation, rivals gain room to maneuver. Canada currently manages and defends Arctic lanes that would otherwise require the U.S. to triple its border surveillance and spend billions on new defense infrastructure. Canada does for the U.S. what dozens of allies do collectively for other great powers. To dismiss this as optional is to misunderstand the very architecture of American safety. This reality forces us to confront the impossibility of a merger and the absolute necessity of alliance. Given these immense dependencies, some might ask, if Canada is so vital, why do the countries remain separate? Why not merge? This question occasionally surfaces, usually in the context of frustration with the border or fantasies of resource annexation, but a closer look at the demographics and politics as analyzed by geopolitical strategists like Peter Zahn reveals why a merger is a fantasy and why the alliance is the only viable path. The United States is not going to invade Canada, and the idea that a majority of Canadians would petition for U.S. membership is a stretch. What is more often discussed in theoretical scenarios is the secession of individual provinces, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan. These are the richest, youngest, and most resource-heavy provinces culturally and economically aligned with the American Mountain West. However, the political math of such a merger is a nightmare. Integrating Alberta and Saskatchewan might appeal to U.S. conservatives, but what if the rest, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, represent millions of people with political leanings that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Washington? Adding 10 provinces would mean 20 new senators and roughly 50 representatives. It would be a political earthquake that neither the Republicans nor the Democrats could likely control or survive in its current form. Furthermore, the economic burden would be immense. Eastern Canada, particularly the maritime provinces and parts of Quebec, has an aging demographic profile that looks more like Europe than America. The U.S., already struggling with the costs of Social Security and Medicare, would be absorbing a massive population of retirees. The financial logic simply doesn't hold up. Therefore, the United States cannot own Canada, and it cannot ignore Canada. It must work with Canada. The relationship must be one of alliance, because the alternatives, annexation or isolation, are impossible or catastrophic. The structural realities of demographics and debt ensure that the two nations must remain distinct political entities, which makes their cooperation all the more essential. When you cannot absorb your neighbor and you cannot survive without them, you must respect them. We are now witnessing a geopolitical recalibration that reveals the true cost of rhetoric. This brings us back to the panic in Washington. The reaction to the optional comment was not about Canada alone. It was about the fear that a comment once spoken can become a permission slip, a signal that the guardrails of U.S. grand strategy are dissolving. We are entering a world defined by blocks, not nations. Regional systems are the new units of power. China is accelerating its Belt and Road partnerships. Russia is consolidating influence. The European Union is doubling down on integration. In a world trending toward consolidation, fragmentation is strategic self-harm. When Washington implies that its core partner is optional, it sends ripples through the global economy. Investors hate uncertainty. If they sense that the U.S.-Canada relationship is becoming transactional or volatile, they redirect capital. We have already seen this with the lumber industry's pivot. We are seeing it with energy markets re-evaluating long-term contracts. The panic in the Pentagon and the State Department stems from the knowledge that even symbolic cracks create opportunities for rivals. China has spent years cultivating influence in Canada's mining sector. If the U.S. steps back, China steps in. In geopolitics, gaps never remain empty for long. The United States no longer sees its allies the way it did 30 years ago. It is moving toward a more transactional view of the world. But in doing so, it risks discarding the very relationships that give it a competitive advantage. The U.S. economy is the gravitational center of the continent, but gravity requires mass to hold things together. If the center pushes the orbiting bodies away, the system loses its coherence. However, the deepest fracture lies in the invisible architecture, trust as a strategic asset. Yet beneath the economic data and the defense treaties, the story is about something more human, something that sits beneath the surface of every continental arrangement: trust. Without trust, even the most powerful alliances deteriorate from within. And the erosion of trust, once it begins, is far harder to stop than to start. Friction in geopolitics is never harmless. It generates heat. And that heat eventually warps the machinery of the state. Consider the day-to-day reality of the optional narrative. It is not just a headline. It filters down into the bureaucracy. When a U.S. leader questions the validity of the alliance, Canadian defense officials, intelligence officers, and trade representatives begin to behave differently. They become cautious. They hold back. The seamless sharing of data which stops terrorist plots, tracks Russian submarines, and monitors Arctic ice levels begins to stutter. This bureaucratic freeze is invisible to the public, but it is fatal to a system built on speed and total interoperability. This is why Washington's internal response to the optional comment was so intense. It wasn't outrage, it was fear. Fear that rhetoric might create expectations and expectations might influence policy. The Pentagon knows that North America works because its parts are fused not politely, not symbolically, but materially. Defense planners rely on a zone of trust where information flows without friction. If you introduce the idea that the partner is dispensable, you introduce friction into the circuitry of national defense. You create a world where Canada is forced to rethink its dependence, where it might hesitate to share a critical piece of intelligence because it no longer trusts how that intelligence will be used. Furthermore, this rhetoric acts as a permission slip for rivals. When the United States challenges the premise of North American unity, it doesn't just question a border, it destabilizes an entire economic organism. China and Russia watch these signals with predatory patience. They understand that a North America in disagreement is a North America with exposed seams. If Washington signals that the alliance is transactional, it invites Beijing to make its own transactional offers to Ottawa: investments in mining, partnerships in 5G, or access to Asian markets that come with geopolitical strings attached. The danger is that ideas shape expectations, and expectations shape reality. Once the idea enters the political bloodstream that the foundation is negotiable, the glue that holds the system together begins to dry out. And once dry, it cracks. Architecture can be weakened without being demolished. All it takes is repeated doubt, repeated signals that the partnership is a burden rather than an asset. Over time, the unique family-like relationship devolves into a standard diplomatic one full of red tape and suspicion. This drying out creates a strategic vulnerability that no budget increase can fix. You cannot buy trust. You cannot legislate goodwill.